Thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight, and thank you Jack and the guys at the Real Lecture for inviting me down here to speak about my work. As I've already mentioned, my name is Matt Goodman, and my office is Matt Goodman Architecture Office, or MGAO for short. I began working in an architecture office 7 years ago during my kind of studies when I was in third year at Woodmarsh Architecture in Melbourne. I finished uni and I stayed on there as a graduate architect, and then I registered, and now I've left Woodmarsh about 4 weeks ago, and I'm full-time on my own now, which is pretty exciting for me. So hopefully what you take away from this lecture is an insight into the very, very beginnings of a practice, and an office which is only slightly ahead of where any of you guys are at this present point in time. Another little disclaimer, like I said, I've only just started my office, and this is the first lecture I've ever given, so I'm a little bit nervous, and I apologise if this turns out to be a little bit shit. So the title of tonight's lecture is Ideas and Ideologies, and I've chosen this title because of a few reasons, but most importantly that ideas and ideologies are two of the most important assets for any architect. By ideas I mean the ideas that kind of behind the design, or the ideas that influence a project or drive the design process, and hopefully lead to a better building than just a few different rooms on a floor plan. And ideas, I strongly believe that ideas are one of the only things that really separates architects and architecture from common draftsman and building design. And by that I mean the thought that goes into a project. What we actually do is extremely similar. We design in CAD buildings that get built by builders for a certain amount of money for a client with a brief. So there's no real difference in the what we deliver, but the way that we get there and the pride that we have as architects, and the reason why we call it architecture over just a building, is all based around ideas. Speaking of ideas, tonight's lecture is pretty much purely based on my ideas. All the projects I'll speak about remain as ideas. I've only got one built project, which is this cafe in Fitzroy called Archie's All Day. It's on Gertrude Street and it's got really good coffee, but I won't talk about that tonight. The second part is ideologies. So an ideology is a system of ideas and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of an economic or political and/or architectural theory. So an ideology is what defines a specific architect's approach to the practice of architecture. And this is an important thing here because you can be influenced by a whole number of factors, different designs that you like, architects that you follow, buildings that you've seen, current trends, etc. But an ideology is what is important about architecture to a specific architect. So defining your own ideologies from the start is extremely important in becoming a successful architect. And to define what your personal ideologies are, you need to define your approach and your understanding of what architecture is, what it means to you, and what it could or should mean to others. So I've taken tonight's lecture as an opportunity to once again reflect on where I am in my kind of path as an architect, and as a means of explaining how you might be able to begin to define what your own ideology is and hone in on your own architectural approach. So hopefully I can get through all of this in time, but I've broken the lecture up into 6 different topics. The first topic is context, where I'll discuss the existing conditions and how they can be used to inform a design process. All of this is pretty ABC stuff, so apologies if it's not academic enough for all of you, but I think my architectural approach is extremely simple, and these are the core things that I find really important. So I'll guide you through them. Maybe some of you will get something out of it, maybe some of you won't. The second point is typology. So the context and the character of any location is made up by a conglomeration of numerous different building typologies. And these all combine to create the sense of place, which can be used again in the design process. Reference, I'll discuss a few precedent projects that talk about the things that I'm trying to explain in the first 2 points, and then that'll be followed by citing and planning, so the positioning of a building within a certain context, and then the internal planning of that building in relation to the surrounding context. As I mentioned at the start, I don't have anything built, or the focus of this lecture is more so residential, so I don't have any actual houses built yet, so I've crossed out construction. It is by far the most important of all the topics, and it's not until a building's actually constructed that you get to judge it as architecture, so everything else on this in this lecture actually remains as an idea. And if I'm not too nervous and pass out, then maybe you'll have me back and I can talk about construction in future once I've had some built. And then I'll end by discussing all of this in relation to the projects that I've been working on at the moment. So context. I'll talk through a few different contexts. So this is Fitzroy, Gertrude Street. You can see by the kind of grain and the fabric of the buildings that it's an older context. There's a lot of infill projects, and there'd be a strong sense of the existing or pre-existing characters still remaining. This is an inner city site in South Melbourne, so you can see that the buildings are much larger and the commercial kind of typology is starting to take over, and this area was either one point in time very industrial, and it's still kind of fighting that, what it actually is. This is inner city St Kilda, so this is a clearly residential area, but at one point in time this residential or kind of Victorian context underwent a significant transformation. You can see that a lot of the old houses were replaced by apartment buildings. This is a suburban context in a regional area where you can see that the houses are either much bigger or they're kind of combined apartment housing. They've all got generous back and front yards. Rural context, so open green land. The way that you would interact with this is different to all the others. Residential suburban area, but in a different setting. And then kind of coastal holiday context, which is Wye River, and I'm sure you're all well aware of the bushfires that just went through there. So the reason why I'm talking about all of these contexts is that a well-defined ideological standpoint or an architectural approach will enable any of you to be able to respond to any brief or any program within any of these contexts. So although the project that you actually will get to at the end might look and function entirely different, a strong ideological standpoint will tie them all together, essentially tying all your projects together into one coherent body of work. So is this important? I think it is at this point in time. So just having, not becoming typecast as a residential architect or as a cafe architect, a good architect should be able to shift to any context and any program, but still have the kind of moral backbone that it can still justify why it's operated in such a way, if that makes any sense. Place. So the contexts are made up of many elements, and all of these elements, buildings, cultural background, will contribute to the sense of place. For instance, this is the city of Bregenz in Austria. you can see the proximity of the surrounding landscape, so this really large mountain. The built fabric, that it's kind of a 2 to 3 story, the odd 4-story building. They're all built to the boundary. They've got this kind of pastel colour, which all contributes to this sense of what Bregenz, the character of Bregenz. Again, similarly in London, where you've got the terrace housing type and the white windows, or the red brickwork, which defines the character of this city. And I hope some of you have been to a few of these cities, because they're all extremely beautiful. Amsterdam, again, with the kind of terrace house typology, but in this instance, there's a total different character. Berlin, which is essentially identical to the others, yet it's far more imposing in a grander scale. So the character of the area is much more dominant than the lower buildings. Hamburg with the red brick. New York with the kind of tenement houses and the fire escape, so which add another layer to this kind of European building type. Venice. Santorini, so the whitewashed walls. And that's my wife in the front. She's always jumping into nearly every picture I take, so the ones that I took before were lucky enough to have her out. And then this is all the same in Australia, so this is all relevant to working as an architect in Australia too. So the character of a place such as Hobart, where the buildings are much more rational due to the kind of scarcity of materials at the time, and a place such as Ballarat, where the boom that came through with the gold kind of had this, what would you say, a way of letting people express the intricacy in the facades and their wealth in a way. So all of these kind of contexts are made up of a number of buildings which are essentially different building typologies. So I'm sure that you're aware of what this is, but I'll go through it just to stress my understanding and why I'm interested in this. So this is I call it a workers' cottage typology. There could be various other names, but it's essentially a 1-story terrace house. And they're all around the area that I live in, which is St Kilda West. So I'll just click through a few of them. Or a lot of them. So what you can see is they're all essentially the same, but they're all extremely different and unique in their own way, where the owners have taken the elements that are existing and started to work them into their own unique home, yet as part of a typology they're all identical. And this building typology, the threads that are drawn between them all are essentially a common party wall to either side, so you can extend either way. A pitched roof. A door to one side and a window to the centre of the remaining building, which implies a spinal corridor and rooms which would be served off that corridor. A canopy with some sort of decoration lace. A front fence, which would signify the threshold between the public realm and the private, but it's still not inside, so it's this indoor, outdoor, inside, outside condition. And then a chimney on most of them. So analysing a typology in this kind of way gives you a whole number of elements which you can either relate to or abstract in order to begin the design process. So the way that I work would be looking for something that I can draw out of a typology, that I can abstract in a sense or either react against in order to create a building which can sit within this context and essentially become part of it. I'd hate for people to look at any building that I did and be searching for the wow factor. I'd rather them walk past it 10 times in a row and then think, wow, did you notice that that little house that was there, that's odd, or that's nice, or that's what's going on there. So reference. These are a few precedent projects which do exactly what I'm trying to explain that my approach would do, and I didn't come up with this approach. These are the kind of architects that I draw reference from and I love, and when I started I first immersed myself in their work and read all their readings, and I've developed my own ideologies based on these architects' work, taking them as mentors, even though I don't and have never and probably never will meet any of them. So this is Shepherdess Walk in London, an amazing example of the English terrace house. And Surgis and Bates, one of their projects was to add an additional terrace house on the end of one of these long rows of terrace houses. So this is their terrace house. So you can see the way that it's directly relating to the building next door. It's picking up on certain cues, the white plinth and the rhythm of the windows. Yet at the same time that it is relating to the building, it's also reacting in a way that's making it seem different. So you can see here it's set itself a full brick out, it's set itself a few bricks down, and then at the end where it no longer needs to adhere to these rules because the terrace housing type in England doesn't essentially have an end, they've taken the opportunity to do something unique. And in this case, it's scatter the windows around the facade. And then as it wraps back around to join the remaining, the terrace house on the other side, you can see that the windows gradually start to fall back in line and become part of the language of the surrounding terrace. This is another precedent project. So this is the little small village of Lies, or Lice, depending on how good your Swiss is. This village is a short walk up from Peter Zumthor's Thermvales project. One of these houses was built for his wife, and the other two projects are holiday houses. But the point here is you can see that these buildings are extremely new and modern with the large open windows, but the cues that they're taking from the existing language of the slate roofs of the village buildings are clearly there, and even though they're new, they almost feel a part of the language of the village, almost as though they've been there forever. So you can imagine when the timber eventually weathers off that it'll start to tie itself in even more. The next two precedent projects are in the same kind of context. By that I mean they're in Switzerland, probably half an hour away from that last project. You can probably see the building there in the foreground. The pitched roofs of all the surrounding buildings in the village are directly referenced in the kind of concrete building. The image on the left, you can see in context the roof, it almost actually feels like it's part of the buildings, or the language of the other buildings, but when you view that building in isolation, it's clearly abstract, and it's so it's this kind of correlation between relating to the existing and also being itself, which I find really interesting. And then finally, this town of Zumtig. It's a chapel, again by Peter Zumthor, who, if you haven't heard of his work, which I'm sure you have by now, he's amazing. This chapel, you can see the timber cladding relates to the timber construction of the buildings within the village surrounding the chapel. The language of the construction material of the roof, just the whole kind of, even though the form's different, the language is still relating back to the surrounding villages, or village houses, sorry. Yet when viewed from down the hill, again, the form is just totally abstract. So this is where it's relating, but it's also jumping away from. So Park Lane House, this is one of my projects where this is the context, so it's in St Kilda. It's in particular in that tiny white rectangle that you can see there. So it's a subdivision to the back of an old terrace house. This is the street view. So where that tree is where the project will fit. And you can see up the street there's kind of precedent for this happening where people have developed land and built a building above a garage. Yet with this house, this is actually becoming the front facade of the house. So Park Lane is essentially a right-of-way full of garages, but to create a sense of street presence, I looked to Park Street, which is the opposite side of the site, which has got these beautiful old terrace houses, and you can kind of see the language of the banding of the lower level and the proportions and the lattice work and the large parapet. So I've taken a reading of this proportional quality, and then that's translated into this building, which you can see the proportional breakup that I spoke about, yet the language of the building is clad in corrugated iron and kind of steel web forge grills as a way of relating to the kind of back of house service lane nature of the site. This is a small project that'll never get built. It was a discussion that I had with a friend who was looking at buying this property, this one here. He wanted to put cattle on it, and he asked me what we could do down there. There's a beautiful project by, I think it's Casey Brown up in Sydney, called Permanent Camping, and it's a little copper box that folds up, so I was essentially stealing that idea, which you're allowed to do as an architect. The site is very rural. It's on the way to Phillip Island. There's cows everywhere, there's sheds, so there's a language of agriculture. And these little the livestock shelters that provide shelter from the sun and rain for the cows. These kind of references I worked into, it's the landscape, into this little design. So it's essentially a human shelter that when he wouldn't be on site, it would be closed like this. And when they were visiting, this box opens up and there's a room with all the amenities that you would need for a short weekend away. And then this is a project that we're working on at the moment. It's a holiday house called Soul of Gerringong. This is the context. So it's this little building here. So at one point in time, the owner of this existing house, it was once used as a boarding house, he owned everything that you see in that image. It was all his land, and he's actually buried in this cemetery on the end here. So it's an important building to some people, and I think it's important to my clients, and I think we're trying to treat it in a sense with the respect it deserves, because the council would rather see the whole site bulldozed than apartments built all over it. It's the site. This is the beautiful, if not slightly awkward, old farmhouse, and there's a series of kind of fibro asbestos additions that have been built over time. But in this instance, the way that I'm working with reference is referencing the qualities of the old building. So the building doesn't need to, or in my understanding or my intent, is it doesn't have to relate so much to the town, but more so to the building the building is sitting next to. So the strong materiality and the vertical and horizontal lines and the exposed structure are all things that inform the design process. This is the existing house as it is, and this is the proposed floor plan. So we've essentially referenced the footprint of the old farmhouse and the way that it's working with the wraparound veranda and the central living spaces, yet it's from the street. So from the street, essentially nothing's changed apart from it's been made renovated. Yet from the side, the new building kind of plays off against some of the qualities that are found in the existing farmhouse. And I think that's pretty obvious there that the veranda, the flat roof, doesn't reference the building, but the omission or the lack of a roof kind of creates a nice, what's the word I'm looking for, relationship between the two. And then the way that the front old farmhouse is very solid and closed, the relationship with the new build is that it's very open. So there's a closed house and an open house, or a night house and a day house. And then this is a view from underneath the terrace, so you can see that the exposed ceilings or roof structure will actually relate back to the exposed ceiling structure of the existing farmhouse. Citing. So I'm sure you understand what citing is, but why is it important to cite a building? So I've spoken already about the way that context and relating to context actually is a way of beginning the design process. The other thing that drives my design process anyway is the site conditions. So the orientation, solar orientation, the wind or the climate. And something that's extremely important to me, which I'll talk about later on, is prospect and view. So essentially, what can you see from inside the building that you're within? Now, when I was studying, I was told that architecture isn't just about framing views and using windows, but I've actually found that it is to me, and to design a building to be within and to look out of is more important to me than designing a building that other people will look at. So this project is the Mary Short / now Glenn Merkett house in Kempsey. I'm sure you all know of Glenn Merkett. He's brilliant. This floor plan, this was a building that I studied hundreds of times during uni, and I still look back to it because it was his first building, or his first house in a kind of rural context, and it's just so good that everything about it is amazing. It's hard to believe that such a young architect did this on one of their first cracks at a building. But the siting's perfect. It is a greenfield site, so you have the opportunity to shift and locate a building where it needs to be. It's facing almost due north, so the sun rises in the east, wakes you up when you're in the master bedroom. In winter, it warms up the living area, and in the west, during summer, it's kind of past and you can go to bed and your bed's cool. The staggered plan also creates, so if there's a northeaster or a southwester blowing, there's always an outdoor space where you can sit either in the sun or in the shade and kind of be comfortable, which is really quite generous. And that's it there. And then prospect, so the way that it's sitting, it's elevated in the landscape, and you've got this beautiful view from almost every room in the house of the surrounding creek and the farmland beyond. And then this is essentially a sister project to that. It's the Fredericks White House by Glenn Merkett. This is located in Jamberoo, which is maybe 5 minutes from where I grew up. And this, when I started to look at Glenn Merkett's work, this rang a bell, and I remember it was either I was in primary, it must have won an award and we were shown it at school or something, and this chimney all stuck in my mind, and it wasn't until I started studying architecture that I thought, I've seen this before. This is like, how do I even know this building? Which I think kind of hints to the fact that there's things in your past or your youth that subconsciously will trigger the way that you think about architecture right now, and we'll get to where I start to analyse that in my work soon. But this is the same kind of, essentially the same plan, long and thin, north facing, but in this instance it faces slightly northeast, which is an even better orientation for solar purposes. But this context is clearly different, whereas previously the other one's located in Kempsey, which is on the north coast of New South Wales, where it's quite hot and dry. This is up in the hinterland of Jamberoo on the south coast, where it's actually really wet and cold and it snows. So the ability for this building to close down is something that sets it apart. So the language is the same, but it's slightly different. And then something of note is the orientation of this chimney, the existing chimney's the perfect orientation for the site. So even however many 100 years ago that this chimney was built, if it was that long ago, it's in the perfect orientation. So kind of orientating a building on a site has always been important. It's not just architects who have kind of starting to place the importance on this way of constructing. So these are things that are important and define my work in a sense. And those two examples were two greenfield sites essentially, and this is an example in London which is a landlocked infill project. So how do you relate to context and site and view and prospect in a condition that's extremely dense? This project's by Caruso St John. If you haven't heard of them, I suggest that you dig out a couple of their books because they're, again, great architects. So you can see here we've got pretty much on every boundary there's a building. The site's extremely tight and difficult to work with, but you enter into the upstairs living area and you descend into a series of rooms and sunken courtyards that let and allow light in. The roof form here looks extremely kind of fragmented, or it could almost be misconstrued as form making. But in this instance, I believe that the form is actually out of a desire to get light in and get views out. So that the constrictions or the restrictions of the restrictive site has actually led to a design that you wouldn't actually come to if you were purely making sharp crystalline forms, or you were driven by a form-based approach to design anyway. It's the interior, so you can see the views through and out. The language of the brick on the inside, directly referencing the materiality of the buildings that surround the site. So the connection internally, because there's nothing to relate to on the outside, is done on the inside skin. And that internal focus is a good segue into planning. So the internal planning. Now, where I'm from on the south coast of New South Wales, this is what good design is, and nearly everyone that I know or grew up with, went to school with, would think that this is amazing, and possibly it is. It's an open plan living room, which is, in my opinion, the kind of deterioration of what a house actually can be. So if you just analyse this picture, which I just took from the internet, there's a million of them. We've got a little sitting room over here, a dining room, a kitchen, a living room, and then a secondary sitting room behind the living room. So this is 5 rooms in one room, or it's either an extremely large room where there's the desire to fill the excessive space with bits of furniture. So to me, this is just pure excess, and we as architects, starting with myself, need to provide the modern common Aussie with a alternative to this. This is a floor plan from one of the very first projects that I ever worked on. It didn't get built, and if you're planning to start your own office, you'll work on a lot of these where you do them for friends or friends of friends, and you never get paid and your opinion means nothing. But this, the brief for this was essentially an open plan living space like I previously shown you, and me and a close mate that I now work with and at one time studied with, this was our proposal to kind of provide an open plan living space, but to fight the desire to have a single room through a few ways. So the idea here was that the openings and the view out of the building created a sense that this room was different to this room. So it's one big space separated by a fireplace, yet the character of this room is defined by the view out to the paddock, and the character of this room is defined by the view out to the pool, which is, I thought at the time, we were high-fiving when we came up with this idea, and the client didn't want to hear anything of it, and we actually didn't hear anything from them for about 6 months after we sent them the first package. You live and you learn. This, another Surges and Bates project, and the last precedent project that I'll talk about, but this white building is a brand new building, so everything you see there in the whitewashed, or the stone in the whitewashed paint, is new. This building is a beautiful precedent to look at. It's called, how do I change that? It's called Casa Voltaires, Surges and Bates. The building does everything that I've been talking about, so it references the surrounding character, the context, the local construction methods and techniques. It references the materiality. It's generous to the street. Like, you look at this little moment here where they've actually given a seat over to the public and a small garden that benefits everybody on this street. And then something that I won't talk much about, but the idea of threshold, and what I should have said before in the breakdown of the room into one open space, the idea of the threshold condition is totally ripped out of our hands. So one of the most valuable things or tools you can use as an architect, apart from some of the other things that I said were the most valuable things that you can use, is the threshold. So the transition from one space into another. Is it a 100 mil thick wall, or is it a thick wall? Or how curating that transition between certain spaces is something that an open plan space totally destroys. So keep that in mind when you're forced to actually do an open plan space. This is the floor plan of that building, so I'll just quickly talk you through it. You enter up that step which I pointed out. There's this moment where there's 2 doors. You enter into this entry room where you can drop your jacket and your shoes. Up the stair, well, there's a few bedrooms that you can see, but they're private, so you go up the stair into a living room with a double height space. And this living room's connected to the kitchen dining room. So this is essentially open plan. That's the opening between the 2 rooms is wide enough for it to feel connected. And then upstairs there's a few little mezzanines that kind of look out to the city. This is the entry space. This is the living area with the view through into the kitchen. The kitchen, like, look at how simple the joinery and everything is in there. And that kitchen, like the splashback and the kind of countertop, just everything about it is so simple and subtle that this wouldn't fly in Australia, because Australians are so focused on wow factor because they're brainwashed from watching so many rubbish shows like The Block or House Renovation, where they're told that what these semi-celebrity home renovators think about design is what is good in design, which is just a farce. So we can possibly only blame ourselves as architects for letting it go this far. But the simplicity that these rooms actually contain, so the subtleness of the different bits of joinery, are actually, they don't look cheap or shitty or unthought out. qualities that are contained in the actual architectural building and the way that this building is relating generously to the surrounding landscape give it a sense of confidence that it doesn't need to make up for its shortcomings with, whatever the current trend of dining chair is. So why does any of this matter at all to me? This is the moment where I kind of look at or explain why I think it matters and why I'm actually doing the kind of work that I'm doing now and hope to be doing for a little while longer. This is the context which I grew up in. Everything that you see in this image, nearly apart from possibly one of my childhood friends growing up's family houses is in this image. My family house growing up is in this image. Everything I lived for the first probably 15 to 18 years of my life occurred in or around this area. So understanding where you've actually come from is a great way of looking at what might impact on the way that you design. That's the house I grew up in. Pretty humdrum little street. That's the house there. When I was growing up, it wasn't actually done up this way, so my parents have worked over the years like doing it up, but the house that I remember was much simpler, but it's still an extremely simple building. So a simple building, yet across the road was a view to this, the Lake Illawarra and the escarpment. After travelling the world to various towns in, as wanky as that sounds, to various European cities, it's not until I actually go back home to visit mum and dad that I actually think far out, like how beautiful is the place that I grew up in. And at the time when you're actually growing up in a place and you're not focused on architecture and you're not focused on looking at things around you, you kind of miss so much. So beginning an architectural journey at uni actually gave me the eyes to start to look at the world totally differently, and I'm sure you all feel exactly the same. This is a floor plan drawn from memory of that house that I just showed you. So you can see that there's a grouping of rooms. This was the lounge room, kitchen, and a rear kind of sitting room, and then 3 bedrooms with 1 bathroom and a large deck. Now, the space, these 3 spaces always felt connected, even though they're kind of not. You could call through to them. It always felt like an open plan house, but it's clearly made up of cells. And then there was this weird thing where this was a corridor that you could run around this as a kid. My parents put a toilet in here in a little cupboard to kind of shut that down, but I don't know why it was ever there, but I can't fault it for being a good device to make the house feel much larger than it was. And my parents were divorced growing up, so my mum and dad lived in the other house, and my dad and mum lived in this house. This is in the hinterland of Queensland, so just outside of Noosa, on this house here. So you imagine living in that other house and then coming up to this house. I lived here for a couple of years too, and just like the kind of proximity to nature is really has a really strong impact on how I feel about, like, when we were young, my ma was pretty crazy, and we'd like hug the trees and shit down in the backyard. We really we'd hug them. So this is the house, and this is the garden. Like this place, they've sold it now, but it just remains in. I found this on an old camera. You can tell how poor the quality is, but it's such a beautiful place, and it was clearly a great house, but it was about looking out. This is the floor plan, again drawn from memory. So you'd enter into this kind of informal living space, a few bedrooms and some service areas. This was the lounge room, so it has that for kind of hierarchy, like the TV was rarely on. So it was just a large open space with a dining table in this area, and we lived in this kitchen, around this kitchen table, or out here on the north-facing deck. Now, this is a great kind of way of analysing or thinking through your previous houses to understand your kind of where your spatial intelligence, if you've ever read the Leon Van Schaik book about your understanding of space. It's also a great activity for anybody who doesn't have a life. Now, these are a few of my projects that I've worked on in the past, and this is one thing that I'll say too. A lot of these projects are unbuilt and they'll never ever be built. But if all of them have, like, they started and they fell flat, but I've went back to them over time and developed them and resolved them to a point that if it was a project that I was actually going to deliver, this is what it is. So I've developed these further than when they fell flat or were passed in, or I realised that I wasn't going to ever get paid, as a way of getting it out of my head and getting something tangible that can be commented on by either friends or to use on Instagram, or just anything to kind of say, this is what I'm about. So I suggest any of you, if you've got an idea, don't tell anyone about it, just do it and get it out and let people tell you if it's good or if it's shit. So this is the site. It's in Valor. This was the very first project that I ever worked on, and it was for a mate who moved from where we all grew up to outside of Coffs Harbour, and I was trying to force a design on. He asked me for some design input, and it turned out the design input that he wanted was advice on where he could possibly put a mini orb feature wall in the house that he designed, which what people think architects do is unbelievable. So this is the site here. That's the existing shed before he actually built his own house. This is the view from his house. So the project's located on the ridge, and it looks down into a valley. So there's this flat kind of triangular section of land, and then it just rapidly falls away to this view. And you can see the deck that he'd started to build in himself when I was no longer needed. But you can't really see it there. The project's sited along the ridge, so it runs along the ridge, faces the view, and it's also the perfect orientation for the sun. So it faces north-east slightly. You get the eastern sun in the morning to wake you up when you want to go to work, and during winter the sun penetrates the length of the building to heat up this kind of small thin plan. And then the planning of the place is, the building kind of reads as one homogeneous rural building, so the reference is quite obvious. But once you're inside the building, it's broken into 3 pavilions, which one's a kind of workshop for him, a studio for his wife, who was a photographer, an entry space, which is external, then the living pavilion, which has got a small, or a dining room, a kitchen, and a lounge room, an external dining room, and then the living wing. So they had 2 young kids, and possibly will have a future kid, so when Luca gets older he would have moved into this room and there'd be either a guest room. So I thought this was a brilliant idea. He didn't want to have a bar of it. He built his own house in the end, which is way more useful than anything that I can do with a couple of hours on CAD. So this is the view to the entry. So you actually enter through the wall into another outdoor space. And then this is the transition space. The idea there was if clients came round, you're in this entry space and you can enter into the photography studio or into the private living area of the house. It's the view from the dining room out into the down into the valley. and then back the opposite way. So you can see the way that I was hoping that these openings would start to open or close in relation to the view outside, and they'd also act they'd be smaller and more private when the privacy was needed for the bedroom. Remo House, this is a job that was clearly just made up. I was project architect on the Penguin Viewing Pavilion down at Phillip Island, so for about a year I was going to weekly site visits, or fortnightly site visits, sorry, and I'd stop here and have lunch. And this was the view on this one day, and it just struck me how amazing a house in this context would actually be. And these rural references that were flooding through my mind because of the other house, the little small retreat that I already mentioned. So these kind of things were already informing a design. And I had the idea that I'd design this up and give it to the landowner to see what had happened. So you can see here we've got this, like the strong, or the really busy road. So the building's actually this concrete wall. The building's sunken in the earth, but the concrete wall creates a little courtyard which gives privacy to the bedrooms. And then this tight little plan actually creates this sense of space through the use of corridor, which is often a bad thing because corridors are seen as wasted space. But as you saw in the house I grew up, I see the corridor as a way of creating movement through the house, and also with the use of openings at the end, they can give a sense of openness. So that's the house. It reads as just a box from the outside, or the view from the road. But then as you kind of come round, you start to see the openings, so people from the street would never see this view. And that's a view of the entry. And then this is what really drove the planning. So I forgot to mention, you've got two orientations. So one, back to that original idea that the view creates the character for each room. If you remember that I said that. Then the character of this room is the farm view. So this looks down across the farmland to the farm. It's at a lower level to the land. It's just one step up. And then the living room is actually suspended out over the area, so it kind of looks out to Western Port and essentially gives you a total different character, which would have been unreal. For those of you who want to know what happens when you put a full documented design in somebody's letterbox with a business card, the answer is nothing. Not yet, anyway. Wye River House. Now, this is a beautiful project, and Wye River, I realised when we were speaking about it earlier, Jack, that I missed out a photo that kind of justifies why Wye River is important to me. But anyway, me and my wife and friends always holiday down here. We have houses down here for hire houses for different birthdays and things. And the week before the fires came through, we were actually down there for a friend's birthday, and we saw the first fire come through that was actually stopped. The houses were saved by the CFA. But a week later at Christmas, as you'd all be well aware, the fires came through and burnt through the place and destroyed 116 homes. And, you know, I don't have any other real skill apart from a passion for architecture and the ability to draw up plans to get through planning and document a building to get a building permit and help out on site if needed. That's really all we actually do. We just got ideas and not a lot of time to see them through. So I wanted to do something to help, so I contacted the CFA and the general store and the pub. I thought these hubs would be able to get my message out to somebody. And there was 12 people who permanently resided in the town who offered my services pro bono to redocument their house, either A, to look through their records and try and get their house built exactly the same way as it was previously, or to start the design process and give them exactly what they wanted in a new house as a way of helping out. I got a call from a great guy called Tony, who is the only one that's been in contact, and I'm actually helping him and his wife now in the design of their house. And when I got the call, I didn't realise how great it was, because he was actually one of the CFA firefighters who he lost his home on Christmas Eve. He saw his house burn down, yet he still fought the fires for 2 weeks while his wife and dog and cat had escaped to safety. So like, the guy's an absolute hero. And to be able to help this guy through design is just like, it's exactly why I got in contact with him to do what I'm doing. So they've got really rad taste too, so I think that we could get something really cool out of it. So this is the site. Like, look at the site, it's just devastation. The site's even worse than this. So it used to be a gradual slope, like one continuous slope with a 20-metre fall across the block, but there was no big excavated sections, and Grocon, to pull some of the lower houses out, had to actually cut these large roads in to drag everything out. So they've absolutely destroyed their site. Like, so they're just gutted, and nearly half these trees have all been cut down after the fact because they were marked as dangerous. So an area which once was densely covered in trees and would have been just so beautiful is now just a mudslide. So it's even too early to get a surveyor in. As you'll see, the drawings are pretty light on, but we can't get a surveyor in because they're not sure what the land's going to... They haven't stopped excavating yet, so we don't know what it's going to be. But this is the view, which is beautiful. The red line was the existing house, and the grey's the kind of footprint that we're doing. So they want to shift the building to look at the view a little better. This is the floor plan. So we've used a kind of central staircase and a void to separate the living and sleeping areas. And downstairs is the office. Leslie, the client, she's actually a cleaner. And another terrible thing, she's a cleaner that cleans the holiday homes in Wye River. And when you think, I think she lost 90% of her business as well in the fires. So you think, your life's gone and also your livelihood. So it's pretty shit. But we're rebuilding their lives, and hopefully we can do something that'll make them even better with this design. So downstairs is the office, upstairs is the living, and this corridor space here actually creates privacy between the kind of public living areas of the house, so where friends might come, yet clients can't actually see into this area, so there's still this level of privacy. This is the first crack at the house, so it won't look like this. We're still developing it, but the idea is essentially there. That's this singular skin. Loosely, the skillion roof references some of the old surf shacks. It also has a highlight window on the northern side, so the skillion lets light penetrate into the south-facing living room. And then you can see this kind of terrace thing facing out to that amazing view. Terrace thing. This is the central void, so every time you arrive home, you've... forgot to describe it, but on this wall is actually just a blank wall, so the whole wall would just be one material with a door, and that's a way of providing security to the house, because there's only, I think, 36 permanent residents roughly in Wye River, yet there's 100 or 300 or so homes. People actually come down and break into all these homes, so that there's an element of security there with this singular skin fortress. But once you've walked through that solid wall, straight away you've got this double height space and the view through down and the view through out to the tree. And then the living area is all focused around framing the view. How long have I got, Jack? I've only got 2 more projects to talk about anyway. So this is Cooner Bay House. This is another house that won't get built, and possibly because the client that this house is for knows another client that I'm working for, and we're doing some townhouses down in Gerringong, and the clients for this house actually want to move into one of those townhouses, which is a shame because I really like this design. So the site is this little house here, and the original site was that entire block. The client's parents subdivided, built this house right next to it, and now Jake and Lara are actually renting this house off them with the intent to possibly buy the house, but it's so cramped, they've got 2 kids, that they want to extend the house. So the only area to extend is this small little area in between the 2 houses, which is, I think, is really cool. That's the view that they want to make the most of too. So this whole house essentially makes the most of a view out to the escarpment and the lake that I pointed out before, a view down this park, down through this park, and this road is like it's only a residential street, but it points all the way back to the escarpment in the distance. So the little box is actually connecting the views to everything that's around this area. So even though it's a really small plan, it's actually kind of trying to make itself feel much more open through the use of view. This is the existing plan. This is like a little sun room, which no longer gets any sun because of the house that the parents built right next door. And there's 2 bedrooms and a living room and a kind of odd dining room. So we're proposed to knock the back of the house off and build 4 additional rooms. So a kitchen and a bedroom, and then upstairs a living room and a bedroom. So that does one thing. It gives this tiny house 4 potential bedrooms, which people love bedrooms, and also creates this position to actually view all these amazing things that are around the site. So this is the street view, and you can see it's kind of the character of the old building still exists. The language of the weatherboards just continued around into the new section, yet the new section is just a kind of abstract box with openings that sits behind it. So there's this kind of odd relationship. And again, I designed this a few years ago now, and I was clearly referenced by a lot of the projects that have boxy roofs and square windows, but I still think it's really nice. And then this is the living room, which that window views the escarpment, that window views the lake, and that window views the park. And I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of the images I always try and sneak in a picture of the client's dog as a way of making the clients connect to an image by putting things from their actual life in an image. So I've found that pets essentially work the best and second best as kids. And this is an actual picture I stole off his Facebook where he did a painting on their sofa with butter. And this isn't the final project. I thought I'd end on this project because this is the first project that I did for clients that I didn't directly know. They were friends through the guys who own this, or would have owned this little house. It's also the first project that I've got through planning, so it's received planning and we're documenting it at the moment. So this is hopefully going to be the first thing that I actually get built. And if I ever get the chance to come back, I'll be able to talk to you about it and the construction process of it. So this is the context again. This is the site. So it's an old fibro house. And this residential kind of context, the character of these old fibro shacks has slowly been destroyed with people with no idea that just build these huge monstrosities. Like, look at the size of that house, and they're just excessive. So when I was given the opportunity to engage in this area, I not fought, but it took a bit of coaxing to get the floor plan or the size of the floor plan down and convince the clients that they don't actually need all this space. And now they're just so on board, it's unreal. And when choosing what to reference in a context like this, you've got the view and things to look at, but as it's a new build and it's not an addition, or there's no relationship between the existing to work with, I thought the best way to approach this would be to look for the most civic building in the area and try and, in the way that it addresses the lake, this is the Yacht Club, which is just down around the corner. It's kind of an ugly building, but like the amount of 18th and 21st and kind of school things that we had in this building, like everybody knew it, and there's something really nice about it, like the geometric repetition of these garage doors and the base or the plinth of brick and the kind of weatherboard clad upper story. So I didn't tell them during the process that this is what I was using as a reference in case they hated it, but this is where I got the idea from. That's the view. Now, what I mentioned before, like you grow up in a place like this and you don't see this ever. This disappears in the background because it's just the lake, it stinks, it's windy. You take this stuff for granted, and I'm sure you do wherever anybody lives. The brief for this was they're into surfing, skating, snowboarding, motorbikes, like they're just extremely adventurous. They've got 2 young kids, and the main part of the brief was they wanted a life that reflected their desire to be outdoors. And this will either contradict what I said before about the open plan being shithouse, but I hope that it comes across that this isn't an open plan house, it's an outdoors house. So there's a solid box that fronts the street for the garage, and then a kind of glazed pavilion at the back which connects a pool deck and a rear deck into one kind of open space. And then upstairs is another solid kind of rectangular box which houses all the sleeping areas. So the idea is the front provides security for the cars and things. Downstairs they live with the view and the pool and the kind of activities that you do in each. And then upstairs you retreat into it, again, an enclosed space, so everything is much more tighter. This is the view from the street that we went to planning with. So you can see the kind of boxiness, referencing back to that Yacht Club and the geometric windows. And then this is the revised facade that council thought was far more appropriate to articulating the streetscape. So maybe it is, maybe this is a better approach, but I think it's not a bad compromise. This is the pool. So the reason for locating the pool on this side was actually how a response to the context and the site and the way that the winds actually punish the northern side. So this creates a little courtyard that'll be quite nice to occupy in any type of weather. And then this is a view from the pool that shows that kind of idea of the deck continuing through. So hopefully some of these qualities will be retained in the final, because the budget isn't really big, so the skill now, or this is finding the compromise to get the intent of a project and meet the budget. And then this is the view from the lake. And then this is an ad, and thank you very much.